Started. Thanks everyone for joining today. Hopefully, we have a couple of people logging in throughout. Let's see, Stevie Wonder. That's a good idea. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. This is a Surge meeting. We are hoping that this is interactive. If you want to turn your video on, that'd be great. Today's session is called Insights from the Field, Coalition Building and Governance with Andrew Trueblood. We're very lucky to have Andrew join us today. He's a board member of Surge, and we're going to talk about governance and coalitions. But before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of quick norms for these meetings. We hope you ask questions. We want this to be an interactive opportunity. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. We have some staff from the Surge team on that will be taking a look at them, or raise your hand and we'll call on you as it fits. But let's start by sharing your name, title, and organization in the chat, and let's get to know each other a little bit, and then we're going to do a quick poll to just see who's on, and we'll go from there. And I just launched the poll. It should pop up on your screen. There's just 2 questions. Thanks, folks, for doing that. All right, we're just looking for a few more people to respond. Awesome. And Andrew, just confirming that you can see the poll coming in.
I cannot. Can you?
Okay. I can. How about now? All right, and thanks everyone for sharing in the chat. Thank you all again for being here today. I'm gonna give the poll just a few more seconds.
Dominic, I can't see it, so maybe if you could just maybe
Yep.
share major insights that you can see.
Yeah, I think once I hit in poll, it'll share for everyone to see it. That's my hope. Okay. All right. I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. Okay. We asked a couple questions. So, what stage of regional development are you or your coalition at? We had 47% say exploring opportunities and partners. 18% said building a coalition. 24% said pursuing funding opportunities. 6 managing an active coalition, and 6% saying sustaining a coalition after funding. And then what types of organization are you coming from? We have, it looks like a pretty good split here. We have 6% coming from state government, 19% from local or regional government representatives, about a quarter, 25% from university research institutions, 6% from economic development organizations, and then some from industry, some consultants, some nonprofits, and some independent professionals and other. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for filling out the poll. We will just go ahead and get right into our conversation. Um, just real quickly as a reminder, I want to just tell you a little bit about Surge. Hopefully, all of you guys already know this, but USANet Surge program equips regional coalitions with the structure, guidance, and connections needed to move from planning to action. Powered by the National Science Foundation, Surge supports both existing regional coalitions and leaders who are building new cross-sector partnerships to advance regional innovation and economic growth efforts across the United States. And today we're very lucky to be joined by Andrew Trueblood. Andrew is a principal of Trueblood City, and uh, a housing and economic development consulting firm where he advises cities and regions on economic mobility and development strategies, including leading DC's Downtown Action Plan. He's got lots of experience in regional economic development and planning, and we're really lucky to talk with him today about governance and coalition building. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to take down the slides and we're going to have a conversation. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll get started. But I will ask the first question. So, Andrew, many coalitions come together around a funding opportunity. So, what separates the groups that stay together from those that fall apart once the application is submitted?
Yeah, well, first, Dominic, thanks for having me, and it's good to see some people I know around the screen. But it's really great to be here. And I just want to say, even before we get there, I was surprised and excited, honestly, by the response in terms of where you are in terms of coalition development, in that many of you are still in the early stages, which is great because it means that there's you're thinking about things and being proactive, which is the answer that I would have, Dominic, which is I think the coalitions, not only that are more successful in getting funding, but that are more successful once they get funding and that are more successful to be sustainable after that funding ends, which we're watching some of the funding from like the big groups like Build or the big programs like Build Back Better, Regional Challenge, and Good Jobs Challenge. We're seeing that funding kind of end. Those who can sustain are the ones who were brought together around a strategic mission, a vision, a North Star, and all sort of brought together before the funding came together. That's not to say that I did see some that came together through the funding and were able to kind of figure out how to work together. But now, the time to do it, the time to do a lot of that I think that makes it easiest is now before the funding comes. When the funding comes, then people know each other, they're comfortable working with each other. You might need to change some things here and there to fit within the parameters of any individual program, whether it's NSF Regional Innovation Engines or Build Back Better or tech hubs or whatever it might be. But having been together and having a sense of each other, I think was really made those coalitions stand out.
Great. And then off of that, what should coalition leaders be doing before? I mean, you talked about this a little bit, but like, what are like the first steps as you prepare?
It's interesting. And it's interesting also looking at the answers that the majority university, which makes sense. This is, a program, supported by NSF, which has such deep connections to our research institutions. It's interesting to see the university there. And I think it's a good reminder that what we're talking about are really cross-sector coalitions. So, there are coalitions of similar minded. I saw someone who, if you're a coalition of business groups or industry or a coalition of research institutions, there are all sorts of coalitions are all over the place. But I think what we're really zooming in on are the ones that bring together different groups that don't always talk. And we saw that through these programs. You bring together your innovation sector, your research sector, they sometimes talk with your economic development sector. Sometimes they talk with them, but also you layer in groups like workforce, community organizations, your state apparatus, whether that's economic development or workforce, and you bring to some that I thought were really interesting would even then look even at K-12 and how is that aligning with the work they're doing? And having everybody come together, each with their own mission, each with their own day job, each with a thing that they're trying to do, but finding an overlap and of those concentric circles, the Venn diagram, the place where you can all agree on a thing that to work on together as a region. I think that is actually it takes work. It takes work in terms of defining that agreement. It takes work in terms of working together and building ways of working. And that's, we use the word governance, and governance has, in this world has a very specific meaning of like decision making. But I think what I've seen, especially the coalitions that are moving forward, it's they have ways of working and ways of disagreeing, maybe. And that kind of soft social capital can be built now, even without a specific funding program happening.
And do you have any examples from your own work of where you've gotten off to a good start with the coalition before funding opportunity came?
Yeah, so I'll talk. Let me. It's interesting when we talk about funding opportunities because let's be clear about it takes funding. Yeah, it takes
Hmm.
resources, whether or not explicit funding or in-kind funding to put people together and have them spend some of their time together in a day, right? So I just want to acknowledge it's not costless, and that's one of the barriers to success. I also should say, Dominic, for those just around there, my experience has been primarily supporting a nonprofit organization called America Achieves, as it helped regions apply for funding for good jobs, build back better, regional challenge, regional innovation engines, and tech hubs, and then tech hubs phase one and phase two. And so we worked on the application side, so I saw that. But what I've really come to enjoy is the actually how do we do this? How do we make these complex? How do we like if we've won funding? How do we implement projects? How do we have shared accountability? How do we build governance? How do we then move beyond one funding program into a long-term lasting coalition? So it's just worth saying. Through that, I've worked with directly over 2 dozen regions, but indirectly with over 80 regions that have done this work. So I just want to put that out there. But there's a few that I've worked closely with, and I see Dale, you've raised your hand. I know there are people. I think I see questions coming. So I want to acknowledge that. I'll make this point, and then I'll step away. Which is, I think a really interesting example a group that I continue to work with, which is the Alliance for Building Better Medicine in Richmond, Virginia. Um, Really came out of work happening at VCU around new models of producing pharmaceuticals. And that was just research. There was a professor there. He got some money, some philanthropic dollars, but they got money from the state to say, how do we take this research program and make it something bigger, not just a research program? How do we actually create an advanced pharmaceutical manufacturing sector? So they got money from the state to do a strategic vision plan around this in 20, I believe it was 2019, 2020. Well, there, so they had gotten together to do this. They had a little bit of seed funding, right, from the state, and then they used that to build back better regional challenge money, good jobs challenge. They were an NSF type one, and they're a finalist for tech hubs funding in this round that's happening right now. So, in addition to additional state money and some philanthropic dollars. So the point is like they sort of built on, you sort of start small and you build, and they were able to take advantage of that by having the people who knew how to work together. And I'll say one other thing, and then I will pass it on to comment questions, which is the other thing it's about governance is people change, right? Like people and positions change, leadership changes, strategies of partner organizations change, and I think the most resilient coalitions are ones that can work together through that. Sometimes that means a partner might go away. I've seen examples where the partner goes away and comes back when new leadership comes in. And so you have to recognize it can't be, and I've seen, and maybe you all have seen like organizations. I mean, and even in Richmond, and I hope I think I don't know if anyone is here from that, but it started with a researcher who is a real power and personality, but maturity means that has actually grown beyond him. He still powers it. He's still the intellectual engine, but other people now have keep moving it forward, and that is success.
Great, thanks. And Dale, I see you put your hand up. If you would like to come off mute and ask a question, that'd be great.
And I'm actually trying to turn on my video too, so I don't look too incognito here. But we won't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think it might
Oh,
be coming. There we go.
yeah.
So I had a quick question. I'm from a deeply rural locality and represent work with a deeply rural locality. A lot of, particularly around tech innovation and coalition building, a lot of it's just purely capacity and the
Yeah.
knowledge and ability within kind of, at least you will say, our region. There's, state level sources and everything like that that are doing a lot of this work. How do you even start to build a coalition whenever you just really don't even have some of the basics, a tech or a innovation based ecosystem within the area? So it just kind of riddle me that a little bit from your experience.
Yeah, I'll use and I'm gonna actually I'm using examples from places I've worked. If people on the call are in those places or in those coalitions, please feel free to both raise your hand and like check me if anything I say. But I worked with a coalition in West Virginia, in southern West Virginia. So we're talking the more impoverished part of the state. The more it was a coal it was a coalition of community organizations that came together to think about what do we do with these coal fields that are sort of abandoned and empty, and more importantly, with the communities that have sort of been left behind. And I think what's interesting there is it was bringing together a variety of community groups, really. Some are service providers, nonprofits. Also, the universities, Marshall University was involved. So anchors also were important ones, universities we keep coming back to. But they all got together and they sort of took stock of, okay, what are the assets that we have? And how do we then leverage those to reach the North Star goal that we're trying to reach, which is kind of recalibrating our economy to be one that can both grow and be about the future. Originally, I would say before this current administration, it was about green energy. I think since then they've talked to just being about like post coal energy. But still, it's an interesting example where they didn't have a lot of seed funding. They didn't have any support from the state. In fact, in Build Back Better Regional Challenge, there were two finalists. There were 60 finalists from across the country, two from West Virginia. One was the state that had a cyber security cluster, and then this coalfields group. And the coalfields group actually got the Build Back Better grant. Um, and I think, that obviously gave them capacity. They never, though, in that, for example, we're getting a little weedy into governance, but one word that you oftentimes hear with governance is backbone organization. And some places have the capacity to have a full-time organization that is dedicated to this. They never did that. They basically had one of their organizations that served as sort of the point and the lead, but was still had its day job. And so I think it's a good example where what they did, and this is the playbook, right? Which is look at the assets that you have and what is it that makes what they have special? Also what are the challenges? But they looked at the assets and said, how do we leverage these? The assets not only of the coal infrastructure and the land that maybe could be turned into solar or production of, for example, batteries or other kind of renewable sources, but also the assets we have in terms of our anchor institutions and how can those align? So how does it align with the programs at Marshall University, for example? And so I think that it was kind of those kernels that got them started. And then they were able to build into a much bigger five-part strategy with working groups and thinking about housing and thinking about how they're going to survive beyond the Build Back Better Regional Challenge. I think just one other point, and it isn't your question, but I think it's worth mentioning when we're talking about kind of sustainability of these coalitions. There was a point, and I was working with them. This is one of the things I worked with them at America Achieves on is okay, you see Build Back Better is going to end in 2 years. You have a chance here. You have an opportunity, you have an option. You could stop or you could keep going. And so like let's assess like have you been successful? Are there opportunities for you to keep going? Or does everyone just go on their way? Dominic, back to your early question. And they said we've done enough, we've enjoyed working together enough, we've made enough progress that we want to keep going. Oh, sorry. And I just want to say one more thing about tech. This is a little, I'm in Washington, D.C. This is where I live and I've worked very closely. I mean, there's different can mean a few different things. Um, in the broadest sense, everything we do is technology, right? Like everything is technology enabled, pretty much everything. Everything has a tech element to it and is about deploying some sort of level of technology. I mean, maybe there are not exam maybe if you're like hiking in the Appalachians, but even then, like there's a tech layer. But like for the most part, when we're talking about industries and sectors, there's an important tech component. So tech applies everywhere. And to some people, and this is true in my hometown, tech sometimes means VC-backed startups. And I think I just want to caution, this is just from my experience, VC-backed startups is a very small part of our economy, a very small part of our job growth, and I think a very small part of the future job growth, especially given where artificial intelligence is going. And so I think not to say, VC is a funder of stuff and you should think about it and it's important, but in many communities, and I would argue in Washington, D.C., I don't think VC and tech are going to be the answer to our future growth and prosperity. I think it is sometimes the more boring things like, regular banking, or I see CDFIs, they're not boring, but they're important. But other types of funding and financing for businesses, maybe that won't be unicorns, maybe they'll never be worth $1 billion, but if your work can create 10, $50 million companies, that can be life-changing for those founders. But also, if those companies are creating jobs, that is really oftentimes, at least the work that I'm doing, that is what we're trying to index on. And so just something that we've been thinking about here.
Great. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Dale, for the question. We sort of touched on this a little bit, but I want to sort of move into talking more about governance. When I hear governance, I'm thinking about bylaws and org charts and KPIs. But from your perspective, Andrew, like what does effective governance actually look like? And where should you start?
Yeah, I want to tell a story about this because like it was interesting working with the EDA. Through America Achieves, we were actually technical assistance providers for the phase 1 of Build Back Better Regional Challenge. And I think, they were asking like how are you thinking about governance? And they learned from that, then they required governance plans for for tech hubs and for recompetes and some of their other programs. And it's so funny because like it's sort of like government plans and sustainability plans is like everyone submitted one. They're fine, but like the real hard part it's easy enough. It's actually not easy enough, but it is easy enough to like put words about, okay, we're going to have an executive committee and we're going to do this and maybe even we have an MOU. And those are all important kind of like parts. But the bigger part is like, how do we work together? How do we make decisions? How do we perceive and accept like power? Like, how do we align together? I think from that, you also like those things also lead you to things like KPIs, like MOUs. And so I think that it's those are all important, but the bigger part is like ways of working together and making sure that there's alignment and that disagreements can be worked out when they invariably happen. And some of that is words on a page, especially to the point I was saying earlier, like people will change, and so having it documented and agreed to, whether it's norms or MOUs or roles and responsibilities, that's all good. I would say though, when we started thinking about like how do we start? Well, how do we start is like who do you, assuming, well, I'm going to even take a step back. Building who's in the coalition, like what is the North Star and who are the key members today? I think that's like step one. I think there's the sort of next step, and who's a part of it today that's a dynamic question. There might also be people you want to be part of it tomorrow. But I think one of the things that I was astounded by in working with regions, whenever I start with them, I'm like, show me what does your coalition look like? What's the org chart of the coalition? And very few had that. Very few could say, okay, even if they had it in words, could say like, here is like the executive committee is the decision making, they're the governing body and they lead to this. Or we don't have a governing body because we are a coalition, we don't have a backbone, but we do have, a group that's thinking about this. We have a governance group, or we have working groups, or we get together, here's our coalition, it looks like this, and we get together 4 times a year, once in person. Like some groups really couldn't even describe that. And I think getting at least, getting everyone to understand, like, okay, what is this? What are we committing to? What are we expecting? Some of that could change if you get funding. Some of it changes depending on the world, but at least putting a stake in the ground initially, and like, how are we all going to try and move together? I think is important. One other thing, and this maybe, I think I forget, this may be actually answering a question you're going to ask in the future, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is, when we've built these org charts, these kind of org structures, with these coalition structures with people, many times what we have is we do have some sort of small group of people who are helping drive, what do you want to call it, executive committee or steering committee or whatever, kind of drive the big picture day to day when folks can't get together. You have the broad coalition. Sometimes that is membership. Sometimes that is a little more, it's kind of less defined. Um, and sometimes we find like there are, especially as some of these have matured, you have members who pay, and then you might have partners or, other people who don't pay but are still a part of it. But the real special sauce is when you're able to get to like working groups, or like groups that are really thinking about specific issues. And in Richmond's a great example. We created a workforce working group that had its own sort of level of structure with the community colleges helping lead it. But building from that, they were able to build a workforce intermediary that they got funding from Good Jobs Challenge to do. And then now they have like an innovation working group, and it can quickly get overwhelming, to be honest. And I think that level of structure is probably not necessary until you have larger grants, or larger funding sources that you're trying to manage and build. But to your point about KPIs, I think I've worked with groups where they get all the data people together. They're like, how the heck are we going to measure success? And let's build our KPIs together. And I guess so I just want to say, like, sometimes, when we talk about coalitions, we're talking about organizations. Those organizations consist of people, and figuring out which right people should be in which rooms in a way that isn't overwhelming, that recognizes that this isn't anybody's full-time job for the most part, usually. I think, that is something what we keep coming back to, kind of maturity. And maturity is probably less of an example than resourcedness of a coalition.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, even as we've been building Surge, we've been certainly thinking about our own um, sort of governance structure and building out a board and how it all works together. But let me turn it over to Arnold, who has his hand up to ask a question.
Hey, just a quick question. This might be taking us just a bit back, but also relates to what you just talked about. So in looking at a number of the coalitions that we're engaging with, we realize very many of them were perhaps formed by funding announcement by federal government, federal
Mhm.
agency is out there. So hey, let's assemble a group of people together to put together an application that goes in. So it's literally a creature of the moment. Um, we may not get the funding opportunity, but now, hey, we have all these folks in a room. We have some sort of agreement on how we're going to work with each other. Um, yeah. I think my question there is, how do you take that same team? Should you take the same team and work on something else going forward, or does it make sense to restart everything from scratch? And yeah, what does that look like? How do you then deal with some of those governance issues related to that?
Yeah. So the the unsatisfying answer that I'm going to skip over quickly is it depends. But I think I want to take a step back to say, I think if you were to tell EDA or NSF or any of these big funders, like, listen, you only made X number of awards, but you actually spun out or gave acceleration to X plus Y number of coalitions, they would be very excited. And I think in some ways the competition part of the goal was to have for them to get for free something which is these coalitions moving forward. What I would say is not every coalition, and I've worked with some that really should not have, like, the application process actually just showed that they probably shouldn't work together. It was a little bit of a disaster. But some of them, it was a disaster, but they should work together, right? Like some of it, like if there is a kernel of connection, of alignment, of interest in trying to like work across systems and across sector or across areas, like then it is important to take it and be like, okay, what can we do in lieu of federal funding? Can we work together can we sort of finagle a way to work together without funding? Can we find other smaller sources of funding, local philanthropic capital, state or local dollars to kind of give us a little bit of a momentum to say, I have seen a coalition where they didn't get funding, but they used it to then go to their community foundation to apply. And then they use that to apply for their state had a big program to get state funding. And that's typically, honestly, it's funny. I'm gonna digress for a second. But if you think about the growth or the maturity, I would argue it oftentimes goes philanthropic and maybe local or state funding first. That gives you the seeds and the idea and the capacity to build or the case to build for larger potentially federal funds. And whether it's these cross-sector programs that I mentioned or a specific thing like a hydrogen hub or quantum, like some of the specific NSF work, like I think it applies regardless. But oftentimes it was funny talking to the EDA folks because they said, "Oh well, we see this as seed capital that philanthropic capital will then follow on." And what we learned is, for the most part, philanthropic capital actually wants to be the seed capital, and they see the federal government as the long-term takeout capital. So it's just interesting, to think about how these, the capital stack on these kinds of coalitions works or works over time. Um, and I would say but back to your question though, like, is there enough of a seed to apply for fund to get a little bit of funding to get going? Whether and the other one I didn't mention are universities. They're a little peculiar. Each one's a little different. State universities obviously have a little bit more of a place-based mission. But each one it depends. It depends on who's running it. It depends on all sorts of different leadership questions, but they can be important early supporters as well. Um, so I think that's the question I would ask is like, is there a seed of something we can do? I think the second question is, do we have the right people? When you're quickly coming together to apply for federal funding, a lot of times it's just like, who do I know? Who's already in the room? If you don't have that time constraint, you have the chance to say, are there the right organizations at the table and right people at the table? Did we miss somebody? Is there somebody who's here who's not totally aligned? And not that you would kick them out, but like maybe you don't, you recognize that like it's a little bit more outside of what they're doing and they're less interested if there's not big federal dollars there. It's a chance to find those willing partners and I think start to build something.
Moshe, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Andrew. This is all very helpful. My question is more, like after you feel like you have, that important stakeholders at the table and you have, created your Venn diagram and you have the interest point. And, let's say at that point you also have like, your MOUs and the governance and all that, but you recognize that there are some important entities or like stakeholders that have to be a part of this conversation, right?
Yeah.
But they're not like immediately interested in that, or at least it's not a part of their priorities. At the same time, as a region, you are working on your branding strategies and, messaging strategies. So my question for you is like, what have you experienced as some of the best practices to encourage those stakeholders to see the vision, to become a part of this
Yeah.
coalition, and how you keep, that sort of energy and momentum going.
It's a really good question. And I think the first thing I would say is coalitions are dynamic, right? And there's always things missing, capabilities missing, partners missing. There's always things that you want to try and attack. There's one or you want to try and work on. There's an organization or a group I've been working with that like they know that like retail, like neighborhood community engagement is an important part of what they're trying to do, and they just have never been able to get to it because they've been too busy with the other pieces. But it's on like it's important capacity they'd like to build. So I think that is always it's like you're always going to be not exactly where you want to be, and I think that's the sign of a hopefully a sustainable coalition that you have long-term
Well,
work to
that's a
do.
great point.
But I think to your specific question, there are two things that I think about. So one is the big like you can't force anybody to come, but hopefully you have an articulated vision that a North Star that is compelling, right? And not every coalition I've worked with has like that clear North Star that's compelling. Like, and so, but I shouldn't say that. Has it articulated in a way that's compelling? They all have it, right? That's the idea. But they all have a theory of change. But like, do they have one that's compelling? And when I say compelling, this is gets back to like not just like a sentence of like here's our North Star, but like real like a sense of like, well, we've actually got a thing here that's special or that you want to be a part of. And that in my Richmond example, that strategic plan I think was that. And they're beyond that now. They're on kind of round 2 or 3, but I think that strategic plan was enough to get some people aboard. But now they still are trying to get more aboard. And I think as you mature, and even early on, like there is the idea that you can build specific cases for specific groups or sectors. If you don't have a lot of if you want workforce and they're not in your coalition, how do you build a case that they should be a part, that there's an interest for them, whether it's your community colleges, your providers, your workforce councils. How do you think about like your work aligning with them? And sometimes that requires a little bit of homework, it requires a little bit of outreach, but you can build that sort of specific case for them. I think the other final thing I'll say is, because it's these are all complicated. These are coalitions of organizations with people at different levels. I keep saying that, but sometimes your in might not. Well, sometimes it has to be the leader, but sometimes it could be people who are more doing the daily work, who can see the value of how this aligns with what they do. Just thinking about the different ways to get in with an organization. Sometimes it might be the leader, sometimes it might be the board, sometimes it might be staff. Ideally, it's all three, but your in might be different. And thinking about so the case you make for why it's aligned, and then how you talk to them at different levels, how you talk to an organization at different levels to try and get them interested. And then the final thing I would just say is take the long, I think the thing about coalitions is hopefully you can take the long view. So even if they're not there today and the leadership and folks aren't as interested, making sure that that you at some point you would love to get them involved as things change, as their leadership changes, your funding situation changes, as politics change, everything is changing. You know that that's an important thing that you want to do, and you can keep it on the radar.
Love that. Thank you.
All right. I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, feel free to write them in the chat or raise your hand. I'm happy to ask some of your questions. I've got a couple more to go. We've got about a little over 15 minutes left. So Andrew, you've sort of touched on this, but I think this is something probably on a lot of people's minds, especially right now, as I want to talk about sustainability, sustaining momentum beyond funding. And you've sort of touched on it, but I want to be really direct here. Like, what should coalitions be doing to maintain momentum when there aren't the major grant opportunities on the horizon that we've seen, over the last, 5+ years?
Yeah, I mean, this has been the real question, for the last 2 years, honestly, or a year and a half, which is okay. Tech hubs is kind of continuing, maybe. NSF has more funding continuing but certainly those big EDA programs are not, um, not forthcoming. And I think I think there's different ways of looking at it. I mean, some places have looked more to state and local philanthropy. I will say it's interesting. I've had a few conversations with community foundations. One of the things I'll just note about community foundations is I've learned every community foundation is a little different. They all focus on different things, but there have been a number that we've talked to that are interested in these kinds of efforts, oftentimes through the lens of economic mobility. And how do we, everyone maybe hopefully is aware of Raj Chetty and like how do we create opportunities for people to be economically mobile and get better outcomes. It's oftentimes focused on residents of your community and how do you make sure that they find a pathway up. But I think this work is all very important because you need to create growth to create those pathways. It's very hard to create pathways up if your economy is not growing or is shrinking. And I think many community foundations get that. So that has been a really interesting path that 4 years ago when I was working on this, I could name one community foundation or two community foundations who were very involved. If you're interested, Central Valley Community Foundation did a lot of work in Fresno and got a bunch of money, federal money. And Greater New Orleans Foundation has done a little work in New Orleans. That they were early community foundations involved with Build Back Better. But for the most part, not. And I've had a lot more of those conversations. The other thing is we talked about local, maybe, local funding or EDO funding, maybe, but we've actually seen state funding in a couple of cases really flow through. Sometimes this is more focused on workforce. That's a real interesting state bundle of, every state has workforce in a way that not every state has the same kind of economic development funding that I mentioned Virginia has. So that has been another source of funding. You asked about how do you keep going, and I go immediately to funding. I just know that that's the reality. But I do think there is this idea that there's this opportunity to bring people together, even if it's bootstrapping, even if it's through in-kind time and effort, and then use that to understand your assets, your North Star, your goal. Even if it isn't a $200,000 strategic plan, it can at least be an outline of what you think you want to do. And from that, you can go find funding sources. So back to West Virginia, what we did, we defined their different areas they're looking at. And it's because they know there's not a Build Back Better regional challenge coming. But now, if they want to go down and do some really interesting housing work, they've identified the sources of housing funding. You can identify the sources of NSF or innovation funding. You can identify sources of energy funding. The idea is like as you get a little bit more specific on the types of projects, you can align that with more specific project funding, whether that's state, local, federal, impact capital, whatever, whatever that might be.
That's a great answer. Okay, I'm going to ask you one more thing, one more set of questions. It's going to be a lightning round. And so I'm going to this is advice for coalition leaders or aspiring coalition leaders. And I've got like 4 or 5 of them to go quickly, Andrew, for you to answer. So first time trying this, we'll see how it goes. Okay, so first one, like this is a reminder, it's advice for aspiring coalition leaders or coalition leaders. So they should stop
Stop dreaming that big federal dollars like Build Back Better tech hubs are going to happen.
and start.
I think start bringing people together and thinking about how you can work together in an environment that's not the big dollars but lots of little dollars.
And then one governance practice every coalition should adopt is
Build that org chart, but not only the org chart, but the roles and responsibilities for the different groups and the cadence. I think cadence is important. Okay, I'm gonna to answer this twice too, which is get together in person at least once a year. Like I mean, some people it depends on your geography, but getting together in person I find is the most valuable way to create long-term connections and sustainable coalitions.
great. And then the last one to sort of close this out here is one action every participant should take in the next 90 days is.
This was a hard one. I mean, I want to build, I do think hopefully you're meeting with your coalition or your nascent coalition. Like I think it depends where you are. Some of you may
Yeah.
already have like been meeting regularly. But I think the point of this is work that is done together. And so finding the ways to be together. If you've already been meeting, I'd say meet in person. If you're already meeting in person, have a happy hour. Like the other final thing I'd say is like it's the unprogrammed time and just the personal time that is like the most valuable and oftentimes the least invested in.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. I agree with you totally. I mean, the Surge team that's on this call today has been in the office all day, doing our own sort of planning and governance meeting, and it goes so much better for us, especially when we do it in person and not on multiple hour Zoom calls. But we have about 10 minutes left. I want people to ask questions and come off mute and either share with the group. So I'll just leave it there. Um, and hopefully we have some takers.
Hey everybody, I'm Brian Agendra. Hey Andrew, I'll be annoying and ask a question. So this one's a coming from some of my experience these days about having the hard conversation. Sometimes it's hard to do, right? Having the hey, we actually we're fighting for the same grant, the same resources. Hey, actually we should collaborate, but we don't want to collaborate. We're gonna go on the side and apply for that grant you just mentioned. So can you share any examples? I mean, that's a hard stuff, but it's really like either a hard critical conversation that you navigated or one you think that we should have more often earlier.
Thanks. Yeah. And I'm glad you asked the question, so it's not annoying at all. That's great. I think there's different levels of conflict that you see whenever humans come together, and that is all true in
I think it's
coalitions,
very
right?
frame too.
So I do. I'll talk two levels real quick. One, I have seen plenty of personality conflicts. There's a few coalitions where they seem to all be kumbaya. But for the most part, like there's invariably conflicts. And when I say personality, it also could be positional conflicts, like different organizations, and like that is just sort of the natural like existence of humans. I think good coalitions can figure out how to like work through that, how to not let that hold them up, how to kind of keep going and keep. This is why the North Star vision is important, and why the idea that it's bigger than any individual is important. But I do think a specific example you said that I saw all over, especially with these competitions, is like an NSF. It's NSF's process specifically tries to deal with this a little bit, which is like everybody can put a grant in. Like there are no limits. They're not saying like only one per whatever you for whatever you want, what per region, right? Per MPO. And so in those early days, lots of people want to have ideas for what they want to do for their regions. I've saw multiple cases where there are competing coalitions, where there are, even within a university, making, they're on different, like different parts of the university are in different parts of groups. And I think that I don't, that is sort of that's okay. Like, I don't think none of these are meant to be the comprehensive coalition of all economics in one place. I think part of that's why your North Star is important because it's defining what you are and really what you aren't, and allowing even within the university to be parts of different parts of coalitions. Different coalitions is good. In some cases, it did require the state to come in and say, okay, here's the horse we're backing. And even then, as I mentioned in West Virginia, that didn't always mean that they would get it. But for the most part, like they would, the states or the economic development organizations, depending on where you are, could help navigate that. But the nature of coalitions is there's no parent. There's no like there's no one person deciding. There's no mayor or governor who gets to decide. That's the beauty of a coalition in many ways. And so kind of it sometimes it felt like sort of a those with the biggest the most purchase and I think the most alignment could move forward more easily. But I think some of it is acceptance to be like we can't control we can't like stop other groups from doing things.
No, very, very helpful. Thank you.
Shannon, I see you have a question. I don't know. Would you mind just coming off mute and articulating it? Oh, loud office. Okay. Curious about some of the more technical aspects of quote making at work. We have an annual report which leaders across our region use to benchmark and set priorities. We have relationships and focus areas and partners that are willing and eager to engage. But, okay, good. We got the but. Generating a regional action plan can be hard because of how many voices and collaborators there are. Does the backbone org generally set the goals and let partners weigh in on how they want to help? Or are they co-shaping goals to get additional buy-in from all partners? That is a really interesting and good question. And I think it's like my answer to Arnold. It depends on where you are. I think I've seen models. I think part of it is assessing the nature of your, I'm going to use, this is the first time I use the word 54 minutes in ecosystem. So I'm giving myself 5 points. The nature of your community. Um, I think I have seen some that I've worked with that are everybody feels like everybody are very collaborative. You need to build in time to listen, to hear, to discuss, sometimes to debate. Sometimes yelling happens, but usually not. We try and avoid that in this world. That's more in my planning world. We're talking about zoning. But here it's usually more civil, why I like this world. But sometimes you have to build that room. And what I just want to, I haven't said this, I've implied it. Everything that takes time has a cost. I recognize that. It's a cost. It's time is money. It costs money to have people do things, to have staff do things, to not do things. So I just want to recognize all of this stuff. I recognize is a resource question and a resource allocation decision. And sometimes you have to build that in. You have to build that collaboration in. I have also seen places that collaborated themselves to death. And, they built thousands of tables, not literally, but they built lots of tables. They had lots of discussions and they couldn't land anywhere. They couldn't decide what they do and didn't do. They had 10 North Stars, not one. And it becomes hard. Like insofar as any strategy is a priority decision about what you do and don't do, if you're doing everything for everybody, then it becomes very unwieldy and it becomes very hard to actually deliver things. So I just want to say, I think it depends on the community, but I think most places are somewhere in between, which is like you do have to listen to people, but sometimes the backbone then has to like say, okay, here's where we're landing. Sometimes that's an EDO, sometimes that's a government, sometimes that's a philanthropy, sometimes that's a university, whoever it is. There is someone who's like, okay, we've heard, we've collaborated, and we've made a decision. Back to governance. In some cases, there are as coalitions mature, they can have a very specific way of making decisions, of moving a decision forward. Sometimes it might come from a committee that's a recommendation that moves to an executive board that moves to a board vote. Sometimes it's a different, but thinking about how you move decisions and important decisions. And finally, I'll just say this, like one of the things we talk about with EDA is with these coalitions, how do you make a decision that like a project is not succeeding? You can set KPIs, but if you're not meeting it, at what point do you say, okay, it's not succeeding, we want to reallocate funding? That is the hardest question. And I have seen fewer places actually take that and make it, how you take that decision and then do that. But I think it is an interesting question or an interesting hypothetical to run through your head to be like, okay, if we had to like reallocate resources, how would we do it in a way that is least detrimental to the whole overall coalition?
All right. Thank you, everyone, for the great questions and for joining us today. I want to give a big thanks to Andrew for joining us and sharing his experience and some guidance on governance and coalition building. Oh, that was nice. Um, Also, I wanted to remind folks that the recording of the conversation today will be available on the Surge Hub. I suggest you create an account at surge.usignite.org. I will put that in the chat. And I also wanted to remind you that we have another webinar. This is just more of a networking opportunity coming up on July 8th at 2 p.m. And I'll put that link in the chat as well. And this will just be an opportunity for folks to come on and chat with each other, learn a little bit about who else is in the Surge network, and get get to start figuring out ways to work together. So thanks again, everyone. Appreciate all of you being here.
Thanks, Dominic.